Good afternoon and welcome to my lecture for Philosophy 3200 on the Perils of Obedience. This is going to be a talk about how obedience to authority can be dangerous for society. The 20th century philosopher Hannah Arendt wrote, "The sad truth of the matter is that most evil is done by people who never made up their minds to be or do either evil or good." She wrote that after witnessing the trial of Adolf Eichmann, a famous Nazi officer who was put on trial after World War II for war crimes. And it turned out that Adolf Eichmann was mostly just kind of an efficient bureaucrat, keeping the trains running to the concentration camps. And what this illustrated was most of the people who participated in the great evils in human history were basically just ordinary people. Now, this is illustrated by a famous experiment due to the psychologist from Yale University, Stanley Milgram. He did this experiment on obedience during the 1960s and 70s, and this is a picture from the experiment. Here's how the experiment worked. Milgram collected together volunteers to participate in what they thought was an experiment on the effects of punishment on learning. He would tell the participants that one of them was going to be a learner and one of them was going to be a teacher. And the learner was going to be strapped down into a chair and have electrodes attached to him so he could receive electric shocks. The teacher was then going to read information to the learner and then quiz the learner on this information. When the learner made mistakes, the teacher would administer an electric shock to the learner. Each time the learner makes a mistake, the teacher is supposed to increase the voltage of the shock by 15 volts. Now, Milgram would contrive so that the real subjects of the experiment would always be selected as the teachers. And the learner was actually an actor who was being paid by Stanley Milgram. So now there's a big shock generator that the teacher was supposed to use, and it has all of these levers on them for different voltages. These different voltages go from 15 volts all the way up to 450 volts, and there are also these qualitative labels on the machine. It starts out at slight shock, and it goes up to danger, severe shock, and then the last two levers on the machine are just labeled XXX. Okay, so Milgram instructs these people, each time the learner makes a mistake, just go up to the next lever. And what the experiment is actually trying to test for is how far people will go. How much of an electric shock can you get ordinary people to administer to these innocent learners? Now, as the experiment proceeds, the learner is just not getting the material. He just keeps making mistakes. And so the teacher just has to keep increasing the voltage on the shock generator. And the learner has increasingly severe complaints. He starts complaining loudly at 120 volts. At 150 volts, the learner demands to be released. He says, "Let me out of here." And then at 285 volts, the learner is screaming in pain. When you get up to 300 volts, the learner completely refuses to answer any more questions and insists that he's no longer part of this experiment. At this point, the experimenter, the scientist in the room, tells the teacher that he has to continue with the experiment anyway, and that he has to treat the failure to answer a question as a wrong answer and continue to administer the electric shocks. At 330 volts, the learner stops making any noises altogether. Now, if the teacher at any point tries to stop or protests the procedure, the experimenter prompts them to continue. The experimenter starts with, "Please continue." And if the teacher continues to protest after that, the experimenter says, "The experiment requires that you continue." If he keeps protesting after that, the experimenter says, "It is absolutely essential that you continue." And then if he protests after that, the experimenter says, "You have no other choice. You must go on." Okay, now the experimenter was actually an actor who was hired by Stanley Milgram because, ironically, this actor looked more like an experimenter than Stanley Milgram himself did. And this actor would just try his hardest to pressure the person into continuing with the experiment, trying to use his authority as a scientist, with his little white coat, and insisting that it's the experiment that requires the person to continue. And so the experiment is to see how far you can get people to go. Now, Milgram described this experiment to a room full of psychologists, and he asked them what they thought would happen when you did this experiment. And most people, the psychologists thought that most people would not go above 150 volts. That's the point where the learner demands to be released. They thought that only about 4% of people would go all the way up to 300 volts. And only this pathological fringe of 1 in 1,000 people would go all the way up to 450 volts, the maximum voltage on the shock generator. Okay, now the experimental protocol requires that after the person gets up to 450 volts, the experimenter tells them to just continue using the 450 volt setting. If they do that 3 times, they administer the 450 volts 3 times, then they end the experiment because they've shown that the person is willing to go all the way. Now, when Milgram surveyed people about what they thought would happen in this experiment, 0% of people thought that they themselves would go all the way up to the 450 volts, right? And they thought hardly anyone would do it, and certainly not themselves. These are the actual results. In reality, Milgram found that 65% of subjects can be persuaded to go all the way up to the maximum setting on the shock generator. This experiment has been done many times, and it's been done in other cities. In some cities, you get even higher rates of compliance. So in Munich, Germany, the compliance was 85%. Now, why did this happen? Was it because the subjects of this experiment were sadistic? Were they getting pleasure out of torturing the learner? The answer is no. When subjects were given a choice of shock levels, they averaged 60 volts. So they didn't want to give these really high and dangerous shock levels. It was because they kept being told to do this. They kept being told to increase the shock level by the experimenter. Also, the people who were doing this showed signs of stress. They appeared very nervous and anxious, and very frequently protested and said that they wanted to stop and that they thought that they should stop, but the experimenter just kept telling them that they had to continue. So it wasn't that the subjects wanted to electrocute somebody. It was that they thought that they had to do it. And that was because of the authority of the experimenter. The subjects thought that they were just kind of doing a job and that they were just required to do this. This notion of obedience to authority involves a shift in the conception of responsibility. The subjects who were doing this didn't really view themselves as being responsible for what was going on in the experiment. They tried to shift responsibility onto the authority figure, and they thought that the experimenter was responsible for the overall conduct of the experiment, and they were just responsible for doing their jobs properly. Now, Milgram did a number of different variants on the experiment to see what factors would affect the levels of obedience or disobedience. So, for example, you get higher obedience levels when the experimenter, the scientist who's telling you to continue, is physically present, as opposed to the case where the experimenter is in a different room. So there's a variant in which the experimenter is in another room and talks to the teacher by telephone. And then the teacher is more likely to disobey the experimenter. Is more likely to obey when the experimenter was right in the room with him. Also, when the victim is in the same room with the teacher, then there's less obedience. There's a variant in which the teacher is supposed to actually physically push the learner's hand down on the shock generator, and that gets much lower rates of compliance. In the original variant, the learner is in another room, in the adjoining room, and so you can just hear his screams through the wall but not actually see him. And in that variant, there's higher compliance. That's where you get the 65% compliance. Also, Milgram found that if you have conflicting authority figures, that paralyzes action. So he had a variant in which there are two experimenters in the room, and one of the experimenters says you have to continue, and the other one says you don't have to continue. And in that case, people do not continue the experiment. And they sort of like wait for the two authority figures to resolve their disagreement. First they try to figure out who's the top authority figure. And Milgram tried to make it appear that like they were equal authority figures, equally good authorities. And then the people would just kind of wait to see if the authority figures could resolve their disagreement. If there's disobedience by another subject of the experiment, then that encourages disobedience. So there's a variant in which the teacher task is carried out by multiple people, like one person is reading the information to the learner, another person is pressing the buttons on the shock generator. If one of those people disobeys, then that makes it much more likely that the other person will disobey. Also, Milgram found that a very high percentage of people are willing to perform some kind of subsidiary task if they don't have to actually directly administer the shocks. So he had a variant in which the subject of the experiment just has to read the information to the learner and read him the questions, and then somebody else pushes the button on the shock generator. And in that variant, almost everyone is willing to do the subsidiary tasks. So he found 37 of 40 people were willing to do that. Okay, now this illuminates a number of incidents that have occurred in actual real-world history. Now, unfortunately, there are authorities that get even much higher rates of obedience than, Stanley Milgram or an experimenter in a white lab coat from Yale. The government has a much greater sense of authority than a mere scientist. And furthermore, the government can actually threaten people with imprisonment and things like that. Remember that in this Milgram experiment, the experimenter doesn't have any actual power. He can't actually do anything. He doesn't have a weapon. He's not threatening to physically hurt you if you don't obey him. And the government actually is doing that. They actually have armed men who can threaten to physically take you captive and do unpleasant things to you if you don't obey them. And so the government we should expect the government gets even higher rates of obedience with, potentially dangerous and potentially immoral commands than a mere experimenter. So a famous example is the example of Nazi Germany. And Milgram explicitly draws the comparison between the subjects in his experiments and the Nazis during World War II. Most of the people who participated during the Holocaust in Nazi Germany, most of these were ordinary people. And you can see that would have to be the case because, a handful of evil people can't do that much by themselves. If there was just Adolf Hitler by himself, however much he hated the Jews and however bad he was, by himself he could only kill a handful of people. In order to kill millions of people, he had to get cooperation from the rest of his society. And that just means he had to have mostly ordinary people going along with his plans. And how could that happen? Hannah Arendt referred to the banality of evil, which was her idea that most of the evil is just done by ordinary people, not these supervillains. Part of the reason why this happened was that most of the people who were involved were just a small part in a big chain, and so they didn't have to recognize their own responsibility. Adolf Eichmann, that Nazi who was on trial after the war, himself was sickened by the concentration camps. But all he actually had to do in his job was sit at a desk and do paperwork, like sending out the orders. At the same time, the soldiers in the camps who were directly carrying out the killings, they didn't really feel responsible either because they were just following the orders given by people like Adolf Eichmann. So nobody's moral sense was really engaged. There were the people who were kind of sending out orders who didn't feel like they were committing murder because they weren't actually looking in the eye the people were being killed. They weren't physically pushing the people into the concentration camps or pulling the triggers when people were being shot. But on the other hand, the people who actually were directly pushing people into the gas chambers or pulling the triggers, they didn't feel responsible either because they were just following somebody else's directions. And that's kind of how great evils can occur. Now, I want to give another example just to show that it's not just Germans and it's not just the Nazi regime. This sort of thing can also happen with Americans. So there's a famous incident in the Vietnam War known as the My Lai Massacre. This was a case where a group of American soldiers massacred this entire village. It was a small village in Vietnam, in My Lai, and they just massacred all of these civilians. Now, after this came out, the soldiers basically said that they were just following orders. That's basically exactly what the Nazis said after the war. Now, exactly one person ever got punished for this massacre. It was Lieutenant William Kelly. And he got something like 3 years house arrest. When they asked him why he ordered this massacre, he said that he just was following orders from his superior officer. And then they went to his superior officer, and that officer said, "No, I never gave those orders." He was probably lying, but there was no way to prove it. And so, one of the lessons here is if somebody gives you horribly immoral or illegal orders, don't assume that they're going to take the responsibility afterwards when the shit hits the fan. Okay, and so the lessons that we learned from this, first of all, most people have a very strong drive to obey authority. You probably would have obeyed too. If you'd lived in Nazi Germany, you probably would have contributed to sending the Jews to the concentration camps. If you were in the Milgram experiment, you probably would have helped to electrocute the learner. Almost everyone thinks that they would not do this. When people are surveyed about the Milgram experiment, 100% of people say that they would disobey, but actually 2/3 of people obey anyway. And so this shows not only the very strong tendency to obey authority, but it also shows a kind of lack of self-awareness. Most people don't realize how strongly they would feel the force of the authority figure until they're actually in that situation. People also tend to deny responsibility for their actions when they're obeying somebody else's orders. They don't feel like it's their responsibility for whatever harm that they're committing because there's some authority figure above them who can take responsibility. These tendencies are independent of any sort of moral justification. That's why I give these examples where the authority figure is telling you to do something that's obviously immoral, and obviously they don't have any right to tell you to do that. And even in those cases, people still feel a very strong drive to obey. After the fact, people might try to make up moral justifications, but these would just be rationalizations. In conclusion, institutions of authority are very dangerous and are potentially a source of great harm to society.